Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on gender and leadership. This session is hosted by the Global Institute for Women's Leadership and King's Business School. And in today's session, we will be trying to answer the question of, do women actually do it better? So my name is Lucky Singh, and I work at King's Business School in the Executive Education team. Joining me today are our fantastic faculty members, Professor Rosie Campbell from the Global Institute for Women's Leadership and Dr. Madeleine Wyatt, who is from King's Business School. Thank you so much, Rosie and Maddie, for joining us today. Can I just ask you both to introduce yourself for everybody?
Shall I go first? Hi, I'm Dr. Madeleine Wyatt. I'm a reader in diversity and inclusion, and I'm from King's Business School. I guess I should talk a little bit about my research, which is generally around diversity and inclusion, obviously, but mainly focused on the leadership progression, so the barriers and facilitators as well that kind of challenge women and ethnic minorities to reach senior positions. I particularly focus on politics at work, so the kind of networking, maybe the bad side of politics, the backstabbing and things like that go on that can be particularly challenging for diverse staff, and I also do research on social class as well, so lots of different areas.
And I'm Rosie Campbell. I'm the director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College, and I'm a professor of politics. So my research has looked at representations of women in parliament and voting behaviour, but I direct an interdisciplinary institute. My boss is Julia Gillard, the chair of the Institute, who is the former Prime Minister of Australia and the only woman to hold the office. And when she finished her time in office as Prime Minister, she reflected on the famously quite difficult time she had in some aspects, and wondered whether the misogyny she was subject to was actually, a feature of just the way politics is, because she because of the way she came into the office, or because of the fact she was a woman. So she experienced some pretty negative press coverage and some very difficult times. And she did a review of what was out there in the public sphere in terms of what actually works to see more women enter leadership positions, also to ensure they're not subject to stereotypes when they get there. And what she found is there was lots of research that was sort of hidden a bit behind academic paywalls, but also gaps in that research. And so as our institute is designed to bring together the evidence that actually shows what's going to accelerate change, and also fill some of those gaps. So we're all about research into practice.
Thank you so much, and it's great to have you both in this session. So for the agenda for today, I'm going to be handing over to Rosie and Maddie, who will be having a conversation trying to answer that question of, do women do it better in terms of leadership? And then we will be kickstarting our Q&A session. We've had many questions that have come through from all of you, so thank you so much for those. We'll be answering those during the Q&A session, but of course, if you have any other questions, please pop that through the Q&A function over in the chat, and we'll be answering those during that bit of the session. And then towards the end, I'll be handing over to Rosie and Maddie to tell you a bit more about our fantastic new executive program called Building Gender Inclusive Workplaces, and tell you a bit more, and also give you some time to ask us any questions about that as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over back to Rosie and Maddie to tell us a bit more about this question.
Well, Maddie, we've chosen this deliberately quite provocative title, haven't we? Do women do it better? And I think what inspired us to think about this was, there was a plethora of articles. I don't know if you can cast your mind back to the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. And there were suddenly articles all through the news media saying that women politicians were handling the crisis better than men, that there were that they were taking a more risk-averse approach to public health. They were closing their borders, etc., etc. And there has been some research showing that there have been fewer deaths in countries led by women, and that women have used some perhaps different language, more empathetic language, rather than kind of warlike language to describe the crisis. What is your reflections on this? Do you think women do it better?
I think it is quite a big question, isn't it? I think it was fascinating to see that coverage, especially with people like Jacinda Ardern kind of being highlighted as a great leader and that hadn't really, it's the kind of first time I've really seen that, really looking at those very feminine traits like communal and kind of being caring, cooperative. And I think it was quite interesting because I've been doing a paper year or so before that looked at different, not necessarily gender and leadership, but we'd looked at leadership styles, and within that we were using people's faces to predict leadership success, which is quite quite a big area of leadership research, looks at face shape, and some of the research on that shows that women's faces, or softer structures of shape faces, often are more kind of rated higher in times of peace rather than times of war. And it was interesting that it was a health crisis that I think made people think about the need for women's leadership a bit more. But I think it's a tricky one, because I think a lot of the things that we see coming out in the press around women's leadership is a little bit stereotypical. So we often think of those traits around being communal, being caring, cooperative, but that doesn't really necessarily true of all female leaders, and nor should it be, I think. And I think there's plenty of female leaders that are, you know, more masculine in style, looking quite aggressive, you know, ambitious and all those things. So I think saying that, I think we have to be really careful to kind of not put women into boxes and say, well, this is what women do as leaders. So I think that's one thing. And I think what women are good at, though, regardless of their style, is the fact that it's been challenging to get to where they've got to, right? If you've got female leaders, it's because it's been a hard, you know, slog, basically. But I think that experience means that women are quite good at flexing their style, so they can be masculine and feminine a little bit more easily, I think, because they've gone through these processes before and they can change them. Is that what you think?
I mean, at the time, about 13% of the world's leaders were women. So I like your point, actually. They've had to go through, you know, perhaps a more rigorous recruitment process to get into that position. But I suppose I also think that there's perhaps a little bit of an elision in the popular coverage of that, of these behaviours, that kind of aligns biology with a kind of gendered performance. And if we think about who the world leaders were at the time, well, there were some leaders who were very deliberately adopting a really hyper masculine leadership style. So Bolsonaro, you know, the virus won't get me. Donald Trump, you know, this kind of Vladimir Putin. We had these very hyper masculine or strongman leaders who were portraying one kind of leadership, which seems to be the polar opposite. If you've mentioned Jacinda Ardern, and Angela Merkel was also raised, very different character, but taking a much more kind of scientific, evidence-based kind of moderate approach at the time. But I think the issue there is it's not about biology. Actually, most male leaders, at least in our contemporary liberal democracies, don't usually adopt that hyper-masculine style. And so we're making a bit of an elision there about behaviour versus biology. But I do think that women are socialised, that kind of very authoritarian, narcissistic, individualistic performance of leadership. Women, and I don't think we're encouraged to do that, and there are more penalties for adopting it. You know, being the hard woman. I won't use the words that are applied to women like that. But it tends to be described as the likability problem. That women who are seen to be hard and strong are not likable. They're not performing femininity well enough, and therefore actually suffer as a result. So we've got to tread this tightrope. So that's my view about it. That actually, firstly, there are too few women to really be absolutely sure. But also, we had these men who decided to adopt this really, I think, destructive leadership style. And actually, the kind of approach to the problem, which I think would be empathetic, evidence-based, collective, it can be coded as feminine, but actually, it's something that's better for everyone if all leaders adopt those kind of styles.
Yeah, I like that kind of that point around penalties is really important. I think women face that a lot through their careers. Whether that's penalties for almost kind of positive leadership behaviour and, you know, more destructive leadership behaviour, I think, because, you know, if you look counter stereotypical, so you do behave more aggressive and things like that, then that means that you are, you know, you receive the penalties, like you say, those kind of words we don't really want to be talking about. But also there's research that shows that even when women are more transformational, they're more visionary, they don't get the same bonuses that men get, not in terms of monetary bonuses, I mean in terms of kind of people rating them as good leaders. They don't get the same payoffs basically as men when exhibiting the same style, which is really frustrating, I think, and that's what the research tends to show. But it also shows that there's suggestions that androgynous leadership, so like you say, kind of more of a balanced approach, is actually far better. And actually what we need from our leaders, both male and female, is to take a step back, look at the situation and decide which style might be appropriate for the situation. So I think we need far more of that and less discussion of kind of, do we need a woman leader in this position or a male leader, and it's just be like, what is the situation and what do we need to do for that, and what styles do we need to bring in, and we need people who can flex to that.
Given the contemporary moment that we're facing, it seems to me to be especially important in world politics that we do have leaders who adopt more empathetic leadership styles. And yet there seems to be an enormous attraction to this kind of strong man leadership. What do you think the attraction or the draw is? Why are we attracted to what we know is actually quite a counterproductive leadership style?
I think it really depends on which perspective you're taking. I mean, academically, I mean, there's lots of psychological explanations for that in terms of, you know, we just have these stereotypes about what we think is a successful leader, whether that's true or not, and tends to, you know, we have the big studies around think manager, think male, that people tend to have this stereotype of what a good manager or a good leader is. It tends to be quite a masculine traits, not necessarily male, but masculine. But in terms of sociological explanations, there's also the fact that there's lots of systems in place that reinforce that. So even down to the kind of job descriptions that we write, the type of rhetoric we use in organisations, it's around the availability of employees. For example, we assume that an ideal worker, according to some of the sociological theories, is someone who can be around 24/7, you know, hasn't been tied down by care and responsibilities. So I think we have a long history in organisational research that kind of ingrains that the concept of leadership as being a male or masculine thing. And I think that is very hard to unravel.
So returning to this point about, returning us to our original question about do women do it better, one of the things that really struck me at the time that we had all this coverage was that we were asking the wrong question, because there was this, are women sort of performing leadership better? Are they making better decisions? And I think actually the lack of representation of women, be it in politics or in business or elsewhere, is a symptom of a wider problem rather than so I think if you've got more women in politics, it's reflective of a more meritocratic process. But I also think there's this really a massively important political problem that we've got these huge global challenges, climate change. You know, we seem to be accelerating into an incredibly conflictual state of global politics. And yet we know that the individuals who are most exposed are more often women. So the women are disproportionately amongst the world's poorest people, so they're most affected to climate change. They're very often, obviously, tragically, a lot of men die in war, but women are subject to particular kinds of sexual abuse and particularly vulnerable in many ways. So it seems to me really important that we have women leaders to raise these voices, but then we shouldn't necessarily expect them to act differently when they get there. How do you sort of think about that tension between bringing, you know, women's perspectives and whether we put too much weight on the shoulders of women leaders that that's their role to do that?
I think, I have this locally as well. You know, I run a diversity and inclusion committee, and it's constantly on our minds about making sure that we're not just making women and ethnic minorities and you know, the diverse staff do the diverse work. And I think we shouldn't be putting the burden on to women to solve all of the world's problems around, especially around gender issues. I think women leaders often get a lot of scrutiny, and that it often is because there are so few of them. And I think the only way to kind of solve that is going to be to get a critical mass at leadership level, to make it not seem like it's an odd thing or this is how they do it differently to the norm, but actually this just is the norm, that we have a gender diverse group. I think at politics kind of at that kind of political level, I think actually we need to kind of move beyond looking at styles of leadership, I suppose, and really talk about some of the skills that are required at leadership and why that might impact women. Because I do bits and pieces on political leadership, not in this kind of same level as you, Rosie, but I kind of look at the workplace politics skills required in political leadership. And we see actually that things like networking and influencing people, and these are all the really important skills that you need to be able to do. And that's how we are going to make change in terms of these big challenges like climate change and things like that. It's how our female politicians influence their peers and male politicians. But if you look at some of the research around politics, as in with the small p politics, we know that women are excluded from networking, we're excluded from building coalitions with people informally. You only have to look at that example with the Sophagate recently. You remind me of the politician, is it Ursula von der Leyen?
Yes.
Who was
outrageous visiting Turkey and Erdogan.
Yeah, so kind of sidelined onto the sofa, and then another situation with the same politician who she was kind of snubbed with a handshake at the EU summit, I think. And that just shows, that exact behaviour shows how it's hard for women to break into these networks, which kind of old boys networks really at this level. And until those networks can become more inclusive and the behaviours they can become more inclusive, it's going to be really hard for women politicians to make an impact on some of those policies, because you really need to build kind of policy change in a very small way between your political peers before you start looking at your followers, I think.
I liked your point about androgynous leadership, because I think I'm about to argue against myself, having said that women don't necessarily do it better. I suppose what I don't like is the sort of essentialist argument that women, just because of our biology or our mothering instinct or whatever it is, are just going to be kinder, better, nicer people. I do think that socialization really makes a difference in terms of expectations that we grow up, and obviously these vary by culture and over time and place. But what we can see is that there are, for example, something that's really struck me recently since I've been in this job is we know, for example, there are too few women, or disproportionately few women, in the tech sector. And yet research has shown that if you can promote technology and engineering courses as being about bringing about change for good for society, then women sign up in huge numbers. And so actually, if you kind of frame leadership as something that is a force for good, then actually more women are interested in it, but also maybe some more of the right men rather than the wrong men. So I don't know if I'm arguing against myself or if it's just the kind of contemporary moment we find ourselves in. But, countries with more gender equality, for example, are less likely to be involved in armed conflict. And I'm not quite sure of the direction of causation, but it really seems to me that we don't know exactly why this happens, but having a more balanced, maybe it's your point about androgynous leadership, seems to lead to better outcomes for everyone. Do you think that those examples from the political realm can read across to business?
I do think there are. I think it's sometimes difficult to make those comparisons because obviously political leaders are elected and it's a very different realm really. But actually, when you look at the behaviours that you are required to have as a political leader, often you do require that, particularly at senior levels in organisations. So you are needing to engage in sometimes quite dirty politics, right? So some, you need to be quite forceful and you need to be fighting for resources for your team. It doesn't necessarily, I think politics in terms of political behaviours often gets a really bad rep in organisations. But actually, when you start to even look at job descriptions of senior roles, they require those kind of things. So I think we can learn a lot from how politics is played in the political realm and see how it might impact our leaders. I think you're right around kind of like this idea. We have, that's why we have these gendered language checkers, right, in these recruitment situations now, is because we know that certain words and things seem to put off female applicants, and it's definitely around socialization, and we start to kind of expectate. It's definitely not, I don't think it's something that we are born with, it's not a trait or a disposition, but I think women and men are channeled into different forms of leadership styles, and just general workplace styles and behaviours, because we are constantly either kind of reinforced to provide them, or we're kind of punished or have the penalties when we vary from our stereotypical assumptions about what we should be doing. I see this, I mean, even at very, very low level children's television, for example, it's very gendered. And I think that means that if it starts off very early, you are going to become, have ideas about what you think is possible and what you think you can or not do. And we bring that kind of idea around confidence and things like that in our women leaders in particular. So
I love your example about children's telly. The Gina Davis Institute in the US does a lot of work about American television and looking at evaluating gender roles as they're portrayed. And I just read a fantastic paper yesterday that I really loved, that looked at women's sort of interest and engagement in politics in the US. And what they did was they showed the participants in the experiment these pictures of the founding fathers. And then they showed the treatment groups. There was a picture of the founding fathers, but there was also Frederick Douglass, who was a freedman, had previously been a slave, and another picture that had Susan Anthony, surname slightly escaping me, but a very well-known American suffragette. And that's just a snapshot of how we are exposed to what a leader looks like. And obviously a founding narrative is incredibly important. But just in that snapshot experiment, they found a really big difference between men and women. That the men felt more agentic and more like they could be leaders when they saw these pictures of the founding fathers. And the women had lower scores. But when Susan B. Anthony, that's it, Susan B. Anthony was brought in, actually there was a real equalizing between men and women. And the sample size was a little bit small in terms of Black Americans in the sample, but so they didn't get statistical significance, but it looked like a similar effect. And I thought, if you can see the impact of a drop like that, and then you imagine what daily exposure over a lifetime looks like, goodness, the impact is potentially so massive. What do you think we can do to try and bring down those stereotypes, rather than, as we know, they've built up over such a historic period?
Yeah, I think it's a huge question. I mean, what can we do? But I think my experiences within organisations, I think what I am getting frustrated with is unconscious bias training, which is a little bit controversial perhaps, but I think there's been a lot of focus on unconscious bias training, and I think it has its place for increasing people's awareness, but I think really to not get rid of, I don't think we can't, that's the problem, we can't get rid of bias, and unconscious bias in itself absolves people from blame because it's unconscious and you can't change it, and it's just there. And I think that's one of the problems. So I think organizations really need to look at the structures and processes to make sure that biases don't manifest within the processes, rather than trying to ban people from being biased, which is I think some good unconscious bias training does do that, but I think there's an awful lot of unconscious bias training that is quite it's often mandatory, or people and people don't really see the value in it, and it often doesn't link into processes very well. So it's very abstract. They talk about your bias, and then you haven't been told about how that would actually play out in organizational situations. So I think how we get more kind of trying to reduce those stereotypes is really trying to put in place processes in our organizations that just encourage people to really reflect on those biases as they are doing things. So in an example, like when they're providing feedback to women and men, and when they're doing kind of appraisals, when you're in a selection process. And I think people think that happens already, but my experience working in EDI and HR and organizational psychology is that it's very siloed. We have EDI functions and then we have HR functions, and getting the two to meet in the middle and talk about these things is really difficult. And I think that's just definitely something that we need to work on, and trying to implement our best practice EDI work into the systems and processes of HR.
Yeah, I mean, I really think I'm very struck by what you've said about this siloing, and it's very evident that many organisations don't treat equality and diversity as a core organisational objective. It's often a side issue, and yet if we don't treat it with the same rigour as we would do in a university, trying to ensure that students get a good education, in a business delivering quality services and products and making a profit, why would we, if we're not evaluating and monitoring and measuring and checking on performance in the same way as we would do for other kinds of outcomes, why would we expect success? And yet I think there's a sense people often think this is just common sense. We'll just put more women, you know, we'll have a training program for women, or we'll have a women's group, and this will be fixed without, historically at least, without necessarily thinking about what are the systems changes we need to make to kind of get rid, to address some of these biases. You've mentioned unconscious bias training is something that can sometimes backfire. Can you give us an example of some initiatives that you think tend to be more effective?
Yeah, I think your point about evaluation is really important. So any initiative needs to be evaluated. I've recently done, been talking to people and about training and things, and I said, well, what measures have you used to evaluate them? And they said, well, we measure how many people attend, and I was like, yeah, but that doesn't evaluate. And then they said, oh, well, we also asked them if they've enjoyed the training, and we're like, okay, but that doesn't actually evaluate to see if it's had any impact on the workplace at all. So you might have had 40 people attend and they might have really enjoyed it, but it doesn't tell you anything about that. So I think that's a key thing that needs to happen in EDI work, is to make sure that we're putting in best practice evaluation processes. But I think specifically around what works, I think you have to look at each of the stages of what goes on in your organisations, the key decision points. And my research looks at like those formal points, so things like the recruitment and selection stage, what is actually said in appraisal. So we know that some, for example, performance ratings are often quantitatively biased. The numbers we assign to male and females in organisations when we look at their performance, but actually the qualitative advice that we're giving them is actually also biased. So how can we review the information that's provided and give more structure to make sure that we're not giving biased messages? I mean, my research has found, for example, that women are told that they lack confidence, which you can't change. It's difficult to act on that the next day, isn't it? Whereas men are told that they lack, they don't display confidence, and that's it's really subtle, but that slight difference between lacking confidence and not displaying confidence means that you can't actually act on those things. So that's quite, I think, those kind of things that we can look at through the different stages of formal processes, but we also need to tackle that informality as well. And that's like going to the pub and all those things. And I think organisations can put in place to try and make our political world more inclusive. And I don't think we should try and get rid of it, because you just can't. But I think it's things like sponsorship programs I'm mentioning. But I think also that, we'll talk about it on the programme, but there's lots of ways we can do those things to make them more effective than the standard kind of blanket sponsorship scheme.
You've got me on one of my hobby horses, which is women lacking confidence, which I don't know. I'm a really big fan of Thomas Chamorro Pre-Musac's work. He argues, why do we keep promoting incompetent men? And he says that the overlap between competence and confidence, it's a Venn diagram with a little bit of meeting in the middle. And what he argues is that there are more men on average who are in the overconfident, lacking competence sex side, and a disproportionate number of women in high on competence, a little bit less on confidence. And then there are men and women in the middle. And that we too often are sort of dazzled by the overconfidence of a small number of men who perform a kind of alpha male kind of masculinity, which is at the detriment to everyone else's kind of performance of leadership, be that male introverted leaders or women introverted leaders. And I think one of the best solutions is actually to really stick to what we know from the evidence base, that we should be measuring competence, ability to do the job. And we often have quite complicated processes to do that, with several stages of interview and skills-based tasks and so on. And then we're blown away in the face-to-face panel interview at the end, and all of that data gets thrown away. And there's a lot of research showing if you do that, you don't hire the best person, you hire the most confident person. So that would be one thing I would really like us to, is to kind of stick to our guns about the evidence base and bring that rigor into how we recruit, promote, and retain staff.
There's also, a kind of fundamental issue around how people consider traits, and this relates to kind of female and masculine and feminine traits, but also the confidence issue is whether they're things that you're born with and they're stable over time, or whether they are things that you can change. And often I think when people talk about women, when they talk about leadership traits, they're often assuming that you just can't develop them, but they often think that men have them for life, and that's it. And I think the same with confidence, whereas so people talk about women lacking confidence and it's like something you can't really change. and they don't really, there's when we look at psychology, there's differences in how we talk about confidence. So we talk about things that are stable confidence, like a kind of something you are born with, but there's also task specific confidence. So being confident in leadership behavior, or confident in leading a meeting, or confident talking on the phone. And there's very, very specific types of confidence. And I think men are often told to develop those specific aspects of confidence, which are far easier to do, and whereas we talk to women about more dispositional trait-like confidence. And I think understanding the difference between traits and dispositions and skills is really important, because otherwise we kind of see women as fundamentally flawed, but men as quite fixable, I think.
Yeah, good point. Well, so we've got through our sort of little section now, Maddie, and so we had some questions submitted by participants in advance, and so we're going to look at a few of those, and then we're going to go to the Q&A. So do put your questions. I can see some things are appearing in the chat. Lucky's here. So just before we start that, the first question that came from the audience was what can organisations and people actually do to develop inclusion? And I think Maddie and I have got started on that just now. And this is what we're going to focus on in the exec education programme. Really about, we're not about fixing the women, we're about fixing cultures and making system change. Maddie, do you want to take over the Q&A? Not Maddie, Lucky.
Thanks, Rosie. No, that sounds great. And yes, let's kickstart the Q&A session. So there's one question that came through in the Q&A here and also previously, which was, are you able to comment on intersectionality and what works in terms of intersectionality in leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why an evidence base is really important, because we can't just read across. Gender interacts with time and place and culture and ethnicity and age. We need to the approach that we take to most of our research in the Institute is to do really in-depth qualitative research to begin with, to understand people's lived experience, to understand what it's like to be embedded in a workplace, what the day-to-day life is like, and how that fits with your own sense of self and sense of identity and how others treat you. And then to use that to devise programs of change that are measurable. But Maddie, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think intersectionality is so important, because it's just, but it's very complicated. So I mean, I do, like you say, qualitative, I do quantitative as well, but qualitative research, which I often find a bit more interesting, to be honest, than my quantitative research, because you do get to see people's lived experiences and how they've developed, and their specific backgrounds have influenced how they approach work and how they're perceived at work. And I think sometimes it's almost like we do too much of a broad brush across intersectionality. I think people talk about ethnicity and gender, for example, but actually, we need to be drilling down a lot further than that and talking about people's backgrounds and experiences in far more detail. But that becomes very hard because of the numbers involved. So, but I think, just as an example, like an Indian woman has got a very different background to a Nigerian male in terms of how they experience organisations and how the stereotypes that people might hold about them. And I think we need to be kind of drilling right down into that, also looking at things like social class. So it does become quite complex, but I think where we can, using that evidence base to understand those experiences, but also making sure that we're not assuming things. So making sure we are looking at their lived experience, learning from how people experience things, not just making assumptions about their category, as we do often in quantitative research.
I also think this is where an inclusive leadership style is really important, because if your approach as a leader is very top-down and authoritarian, you've not got room to listen to people's experiences or to understand the diversity that you have in a team or in an organisation. And so, I mean, I had a conversation with a woman a few months ago that really struck home to me, because she said she was a very capable woman working in a bank, very senior position, and she felt that she wasn't getting offered the opportunities that she had kind of earned with the quality of her work. And her boss said, well, you just need to be pushier. And she said, well, actually for me, a woman with my ethnic background and experience, actually it's quite difficult for me to push past these men, and actually I'm doing really good work. Why are you not noticing it? And I thought that's incredibly important. If you want to get the best out of your people, don't just wait for the loudest person to put their hand up. Actually look at what they are doing and say, you're doing great stuff. Can I suggest that you take up this opportunity? That's what a good leadership style looks like, and it gives space for people to bring how they experience work without feeling that they're going to be resisted. So I think that's such an important part of bringing diverse stories into how we understand the workplace.
Great, thank you. And another question that we had from the participants was, what does the research say about female leadership? What are the results, and are there any clear benefits?
Well, there's been quite a lot done on gender and leadership. Generally, it shows that women are better transformational leaders. They're more visionary, more kind of carrying around the, inspiring their own followers. But it also says that, like I said earlier, they have a kind of often when men have those same behaviours, they get a communality bonus. So they are more likely to be perceived as better transformational leaders, even though the women possibly are. But I think even though there's kind of large scale quantitative studies on this, I mean, it really does boil down to context, I think. And even not even in an organisation, it can boil down to specific team about what is the right thing to adopt. And I think it comes back to that study, I think it was in 2020, so off the back of COVID, suggesting that androgynous leadership is probably the best, but it's actually not the best, but it's the kind of ability to step back from the situation and decide which leadership style to use. And that's quite difficult, I think, in organisations, because you are rewarded for certain styles. But I think at the more structural and process level, we need to be thinking about what our systems are rewarding, and stepping back from that and making sure we're making that a little bit more.
I think that we tend to turn this into a binary, but actually, if we think about it, there's a sort of distribution to this, and there are more women, because of the way we're socialized and we live our lives, who adopt more collective leadership styles. And there are perhaps some more men at the other end who adopt a very individualistic kind of hierarchical leadership style. There are a lot of men and women in the middle who have got a lot in common. And so we see these average differences. And I think my view about it is, on average, women are more likely to be focused on helping develop their team and organizational goals and social goals. There are also an awful lot of men who care about these things. So if we change our system so that we're promoting and rewarding those behaviors, men who are not the kind of, I don't know if this is an acceptable word to us anymore, but the kind of alpha male stereotype, actually it benefits those men too, who actually have got a lot to bring to an organization, a much healthier kind of leadership style. But it means that you also see many more women in leadership positions.
And that kind of neatly brings us to the next question, which is all about men, and it's about kind of male allies. How important are they? How do we cultivate them? And what is the crucial role that they can play for gender equality?
I just think male allies are hugely important, because men hold power in organisations and they hold power in society. So I think if anything's going to change, we need men to be on board. And I think, but like Rosie says, there's an awful lot of men who don't fit that stereotypical assumption of masculine leadership as well. So we need to make sure that those men are included in what we're doing and the processes. But yeah, I think having men in organisations is really important, because they call it the snowy peaks, don't they, of organisations, with all the white men at the top. And I think, in my experience working with organisations, when you've got someone who's really invested in EDI at those top levels, then it does just filter down really well. I think I was talking about an organisation who, like, the CEO is dyslexic, for example, and they'd managed to kind of implement a lot of different policies around neurodiversity purely off the back of that one person being invested in it. And I think so it is really, really important to get those people on board.
I really think, firstly, as a political scientist, women wouldn't have got the vote if somehow or other men hadn't been persuaded to vote for it in parliaments. But actually more sort of, so there is that power aspect that Maddie's raised. There's also, I think we need to expand this conversation about gender equality, because gender equality is good for everyone. We have a toxic culture, which can often mean overwork, kind of always on, valorizing overwork, hostile, kind of difficult to speak truth to power, and so on. It's bad for men and women, because you end up with burnout, poor mental health, physical problems, lack of work-life balance. All of those are things affect men and women. So I think, we know, for example, as a study that I found really interesting, qualitative study in Australia looking at the construction industry and comparing staff in the head office to staff on site, huge, great big multi-million-dollar projects. And what they found is that the staff, and they were often professional services, lawyers and so on, they had the same policies in the both places. The culture on site was such that if you were seen to leave at a certain time to go and pick your kid up or whatever it was, men and women were both called out and named and shamed. What happened was the women exited the organisation, but there was a high incidence of mental health problems amongst men. So I think the issues can manifest themselves in different ways amongst men and women, but gender equality, inequality is not good for anyone.
Definitely. Thank you. There's a question that came through, which is how do we challenge these stereotypes and biases while maintaining healthy relationships, which I think is a really important question.
Oh, I had this week. I had to challenge it. I had to challenge a bit of bias, and it was a bit awkward. But you know, I think we can do these things. I think there's a way of doing it, and I think often people they're not consciously doing it because it is unconscious bias, and they're often not aware that it's inappropriate. I think that's the key thing. So I think there is that element of, you know, there is an important place for training, I think, in terms of awareness. But I think actually my approach would be, I mean, this was in the selections scenario. So my approach would be, if we design that selection system to be a little bit more structured, and we talked to and briefed the selection panel about the kind of conversations we should have about candidates, for example, then that would mean that that wouldn't have happened, you know. So I think it is down to kind of having processes, structures, code of conducts, and getting a culture where people feel that they can be safe to criticise, I think, as well. So having that psychological safety to be able to step out and call out your more senior staff as well, to say, hang on a minute, that's not quite on, you know, and these are the reasons why. But again, I think that filters down from leadership as well. So having inclusive leaders at the top of organisations can help you develop an inclusive culture all the way down and make it okay for those things to be challenged.
Forgive me, I was busy replying to Kate's question in the chat and I've forgotten the question. That's outrageous, isn't it?
It was about challenging stereotypes and biases, Rosie, and how to do it in a healthy, while still maintaining healthy relationships.
Humble. I mean, I do find myself challenging my stereotypes and biases. You know, if an older, broad-looking, confident man starts speaking in a meeting, we can tend to think, oh, here's the boss. And well, at least I can find myself doing that occasionally. I have to think, no, scan this screen or this room and work out who the actual boss is. You know, so I think when we're calling it out, we should do it with sensitivity. Let's not always assume it comes from a dark place. And let's kind of just raise the issues, like, don't be silent, but raise the issues in a humble way, knowing that we're all affected by these stereotypes. We're all, you know, we've all been subject to them for a lifetime. And so we're tackling them, but we can do it in a generous way.
I think that's definitely true around making sure we are aware of our own biases as well. I think my biggest shock for me was when my kids had toys and I suddenly realised that every single one of them was called Mr. So-and-so, and I was having to make a conscious effort to make sure we had some Mrs. and some doctors in there as well, and some Miss toys as well. So now all the tigers on the shelf aren't just the males. So it's things like that that suddenly make it obvious to you, even though it seems a bit silly, I think.
Yes, definitely. So we had a question earlier from Cecilia, which was, I've seen research that says that women have greater emotional intelligence because we are more subordinate and have therefore had to develop greater EI. A bit of nature or nurture argument, and what are your thoughts on that?
Very hard to separate nature and nurture, isn't it? I mean, women on average in most of the cultures that around the world are socialized to think that we need to be caring and empathetic and kind and so on. And you know, my personal view, although I think, you know, it's very hard to demonstrate, is that the human brain is incredibly plastic. I mean, we've demonstrated we can live in all kinds of different environments and all kinds of different ways of being organized. I mean, the fact that here we are, 3 women having a conversation at a university that we're hosting. I mean, I work in the Virginia Woolf building. She wasn't allowed to pass with her degree even though she studied at King's because she was a woman. The way we've changed the way we live is so massive. I tend to think that we're very flexible, and I'm a bit dismissive of the biology argument, but you know, I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, I think emotional intelligence is a funny one, isn't it? It's not my specialist area, but I know that there is that whole debate in the emotional intelligence literature about whether there's different measures of emotional intelligence. So I guess it would depend on whether the studies looked at a trait-based emotional intelligence measure or more of a state or a skill-based emotional intelligence level. And obviously that, you know, implies when you look at organisations who have emotional intelligence training, they wouldn't, well, hopefully they wouldn't do that if they thought it was something that we were born with and is stable over time. So I think, yeah, my feeling is that maybe there's a little bit of emotional intelligence that's we're probably born with, but I think most of it can be developed and is malleable. So it's something that we can develop. But obviously, you know, there's obviously intersections with this as well, because we need to think about neurodiversity around emotional intelligence too. So yeah, I think it's a tricky question, but I think in kind of total, I think we need to think about these things as malleable and changeable as much as possible. I think not necessarily set in stone. Otherwise, we start to make assumptions about different groups that might not necessarily be true.
Thank you. So we have a question from Tom, and his is focused on how do we get men within organizations and just generally to care enough, and to get them more involved, and kind of what are your thoughts on kind of these initiatives to do that?
Great question, Tom. I mean, this is something I think about a lot at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. You know, we have a lot of events that are very heavily you know, predominantly women. And I really passionately believe that if we're going to have a more equal society, men and women's lives will both change for the better. And I think, for example, you can see amongst younger generations of men who want to be fathers or are fathers a real appetite for being more involved in their children's lives. And when we stop seeing caring as something that just applies to women, that will tick off a huge part of the problem. So I think sometimes we end up just speaking to ourselves and not bringing men into the conversation, not perhaps making men feel included, not making men feel like their voice is valid in this conversation. And the onus is on us to really try and address that. So I'm really glad you've raised that question, Tom. And we want to do more events at the Institute that focus on how gender equality is a problem, inequality is a problem for men. And I think it's that issue. Sometimes men feel that I'm not really qualified to speak about this, or maybe it doesn't apply to me, and we really need to address that.
Great, thank you, Rosie. We have a question from Tala, which is, what about the microaggressions if you are a woman of colour?
Yeah, no, I think microaggressions is going to be, you know, kind of a key focus in EDI work in the next few years. I think they are really important because I think it impacts everyone's kind of daily life experiences, particularly if you're in a minority group. But I think a lot of people just aren't aware of what a microaggression is. So I think training in that respect is important. And I think a lot of people don't realise that they're doing it at all. I have an ex-colleague who I called the post-it pusher, because when we were in a meeting, he kept on pushing the post-it notes for me to write on towards me. And I was the only woman on the table. And I just was like, oh, stop. But I don't think, you know, didn't realise that that was potentially a kind of, you know, a microaggression in the sense of, you know, putting you in your place, I suppose. So I think
maybe it's tempted to write on your own post-it and stick it on your forehead.
It was very tempting. I kind of pushed back as much as I could, but you know, I think training around this and just calling things out, but I think that's really difficult when you're the person who's in the minority. So I think you do need allies to actually spot these behaviours and say, hang on a minute, you know, that's not right. And it is about developing that culture of being able to challenge safely, I think, and that is all about leadership and how we manage organisations. So,
and feeling supportive. I mean, if in that situation, sometimes you might feel, okay, this post-it note's been shoved at me and I want to just ask, why are you giving me this post-it note? And feel that somebody else in the room is going to look at them like, why have you given her that post-it note? So I think we can, if we're the subject of the microaggression, we can stand up for ourselves, but it's much easier to do if you feel you've got an ally in the room. And I think that's something that we can all do, is we can say, I've noticed the way so-and-so speaks over you in these meetings. You know, next time it happens, I'm going to do this, because it can feel a bit patronizing sometimes if someone's a savior. Whereas if you have a conversation with each other about this is happening, what are we going to do about it? That, you know, that can be a way of tackling these things.
No, that sounds like good advice. Thank you. We had a question earlier, and it was kind of related to the kind of masculine and feminine leadership styles that we were referring to. And the question was kind of, aren't these just social constructs? And are we subscribing to these stereotypes? And I thought we should address it.
I'm afraid I just saw the comment in the chat,
Yeah,
Celia, and I'm unable to move on from the husband's pants being nailed to the floor.
I'm going to take that. Coming back to Lucky's question, yes, I think I agree that these traits are social constructs. I definitely don't think they are fact at all. They're not something that we are born with. I think it's something that we are socialized into, and not necessarily our own styles, but we're socialized into thinking these are successful or not successful styles. And I think that is something that we are hoping to change. But I think my perspective is that changing that doesn't necessarily come from individuals learning about their own bias, although that's some of it. It doesn't come from fixing women and fixing men, but it comes through processes and structures and thinking about what we are rewarding, what we are encouraging, not just through pay and bonuses and things like that, but also through like job descriptions and the criteria that we use, what we expect from our workers and organisations. So we have to look at all of those things to be able to move away from those stereotypes, I think, a little bit more.
Definitely. I think we're approaching sort of the last couple of minutes, but I thought one question that we had would be a nice way to end it is, what do you see as the future of female leadership for both sexes?
Well, we're not quite ending, are we? Because we're going to talk a little bit about our course, but so do stay with us. But future of female leadership, well, it'd be really wonderful when we don't need to talk about men or women's leadership, and we have as many women as leadership positions as men. And I think when that happens, because of the meritocratic argument that I made earlier about countries that have got more women leaders, they tend to just have more meritocratic processes. I think we'll have better leaders. And I think that we won't focus on these kind of hyper-masculine leadership styles. There'll be a diversity of styles that we can benefit from.
Yeah, no, I would just echo that. And I think it would be hopefully that we just don't have to have the conversation. It's just not something we discuss. But I think the next thing will be, what it should be the same thing as, looking at intersections as well. So yeah.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for all of your questions. So before we wrap up, we just wanted to share a bit more information about our new program called Building Gender Inclusive Workplaces that both Rosie and Maddie are leading on, and I'm also part and parcel of the kind of recruitment and admission side of things. So shall I hand over to you, Rosie, to just take everyone through the course?
I'll just very briefly say what we're planning to do. So we're basically, the course is really focused on the issues that we've been describing today. We want to work with participants on the course to help build more gender inclusive workplaces. This isn't about fixing women, it's about making cultural and structural change inside organisations to ensure that people can meet their full potential. And we're really interested, going back to Tom's point, in men and women participating. It's about what works to deliver change quickly, and what has been shown to be effective in the research, and it will be an experience when we all learn from each other. Maddie, perhaps you'd like to say a little bit more about the course content itself.
Yeah, so we have 4 different modules spread across 9 months. Broadly, those modules are hopefully kind of quite, they're going to be quite group-based discussions, and it's not going to be kind of making use of desks or anything, but we're going to have lots of discussions and learning from your experiences. During the course, we're going to ask you to try and implement a change, something in your organisations or the organisations that you work with, to actually impact gender equality in some way. And that can be something that's quite small, or it can be something that's quite large, and we'll be supporting you through that. But the course content itself, in terms of the 4 modules, the first one's really setting the scene and understanding how to articulate the need to look at this in your organisations. So identifying an area of gender equality, and understanding why it needs to happen, but also looking at some of the myths and mistakes that have happened already, and how you might tackle those. The second module is looking at really those processes and practices that we've talked about today, and how do we actually look at how bias manifests in our systems, not just the bias itself. Then we're going to be looking at culture change, how we do change in complex organisational situations, and how the strategies to do that. And then finally, we're looking at that inclusive leadership that we've been talking about. This is also important. So talking about inclusive leadership of our leaders in the organisation already, and also how to develop inclusive leadership in ourselves and others. So yeah, it's across 9 months, as I say, it's mostly in person, but we are doing some virtual kind of peer support groups that will be helping you through the change that you're going to be implementing. And it's aiming to start at the end of June.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Rosie, thank you, Maddie, and thank you everyone for joining this session. It's been fantastic just to listen and also to interact with you all. And just to let you know that applications for our gender program are open. So if you want to know more, then please reach out to me. You've got my email address here, and I'll send everybody an email anyway, just to follow up. So yes, please reach out if you want any further information. But again, big thank you, and hope you have a lovely week.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.